Last night, Andrew Yang officially conceded in the New York City mayoral race, saying that even though he will not be the next mayor, he will be happy to work with whoever wins. Brooklyn Borough President and frontrunner Eric Adams took the lead and is in a strong position to win the election after winning majority of the first choice votes.
Daniel Marans notes that Yang's performance hinged on how many voters actually showed up for him, especially but not exclusively in the Asian American community. Here to help us make sense of all this is Huffington Post reporter Daniel Marans. Thanks for being with us.
Daniel, first time in New York City history for ranked choice voting to play itself out. You were there on the ground reporting on this. Tell us what it was like. Tell us where we are.
It's very interesting. I talked to a lot of voters who were certainly confused by the process, but at the end of the day, the most credible pre-election poll that essentially predicted kind of Eric Adams with a strong lead, civil rights attorney and progressive favorite Maya Wiley vying for third or second place, and sanitation commissioner Catherine Garcia in second or third place, ended up being correct. It turns out that Maya Wiley, at least in this first round, outperformed Catherine Garcia, really showing that there is a strong progressive faction in the city and that she might have had crossover appeal to ideologically flexible black voters. But at the end of the day, it was a good night for pollsters and a good night for Adams, who really wagered that at the core Democratic constituencies of low-income, working, and middle-class black and Latino voters in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx are sort of the heart of the Democratic coalition, and that a win really needs to go through them. And they're sometimes liberal and sometimes more moderate political preferences.
Yeah, a good night for him and a bad night for Yang, who was leading much earlier in the race, obviously had this national profile from his presidential run. What did Yang kind of do wrong in the last several weeks to tumble kind of considerably from where he was previously?
It's remarkable. I mean, he was riding high. He was in the 30s for a couple months there, certainly. And really starting, I would say, in early May, as the public tuned in with the kind of spotlight on him, Yang made, I think, a number of fumbles during public comments and interviews that really reinforced this idea in the public's head that this was a guy whose inexperience in New York City politics was actually a liability, was something that undermined his image as a competent sort of businessman, an outsider who could shake things up. One of the examples I've cited in my reporting, though there are a number of them, is that he was speaking to at a panel about shelters for people without a home, and told the reporter who was moderating the panel that it would be nice if survivors of domestic violence had shelters. Well, they do, and that became they already do, and that became one of several headlines sort of hammering home this idea that maybe it actually matters that Andrew Yang hasn't voted in a single municipal election in 25 years of living in the city of New York. Maybe it matters that he was out of town at his second home in New Paltz in the Hudson Valley during the height of the pandemic. And maybe it matters that he lives in a relatively unrepresentative slice of the city in sort of the Chelsea Hell's Kitchen area. He of course also famously said that Times Square was his favorite subway stop. Now, that may be a neighborhood thing for him, but again, I think it just contributed to this image that he could not truly be trusted, that he was sort of out of his league. And when you look at the coalition politics of the city, he was never going to have a deep base with black and Latino voters of a certain stripe in the outer boroughs. And so he did need college-educated, not fully leftist white liberals in places like Manhattan, and a lot of those votes ended up going toward former Sanitation Commissioner Catherine Garcia.
Well, AOC came out and said that she ranks Scott Stringer second. Let's watch that.
I personally have ranked Scott Stringer number 2. And I think he's also a really strong candidate from a policy perspective. You know, there's been a lot of stuff going on in the race.
So, Daniel, do you think if AOC would have come out earlier in support of Stringer, that this would have made a difference in kind of the outcome, or was that cake already baked?
I think the second allegation of sexual misconduct against Scott Stringer, by all accounts, based on conversations with people in his campaign, really shifted his poll numbers. And again, with those college-educated liberals in places like Manhattan and gentrified Brooklyn, there were people who had been familiar with him and were sort of withholding judgment. And when that second allegation came out, which had not been fully discredited, they appeared to have dropped off. I don't know that AOC coming out earlier would have made as much of a difference. But I just think that overall, what happened in this primary with the abandonment of Scott Stringer based on two allegations, one of which the credibility of one of which was dubious, and the second of which occurred still 30 years ago, and then of course the implosion of kind of the activist favorite Dianne Morales under union busting charges, it should be cause for some introspection on the left, regardless of the final outcome. I think the fact that the city's low-income, working class, and middle class Black and Latino voters in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx still will not really touch the left with a 10-foot pole should also be cause for introspection. It is a bit reminiscent, frankly, of the presidential primary when those same voters really, or at least Black voters, really delivered the nomination to Joe Biden in contravention of what activists wanted. I don't think anybody has a monopoly on the authenticity of these communities, which are deeply diverse and varied. But certainly, I think that there is a tendency on the left to say that they speak for those communities, and that's just not accurate.
Yeah, time and time again, we see it's a little more complicated than that. The results of this election may not be finalized until mid-July, since there are 13 candidates on the ballot, and no one looks like they're coming close to a majority. So what is this? Is this going to maybe cause people to lose faith in the ranked choice voting system? I think that last minute kind of move by Yang and Garcia to team up maybe even had some advocates of the system going, wait a minute, that's possible? Is this what kind of board game scenario where you stop someone from winning Monopoly is this?
Well, so in ranked choice elections, that sort of thing is not uncommon at all. I mean, I'm probably most familiar with the mayoral election in San Francisco a couple of years ago, in which the two more left-leaning candidates, Mark Leno and Jane Kim, sort of teamed up and cross-endorsed in an ultimately unsuccessful effort to stop current Mayor London Breed. So this is something that does occur. But I think New York City and New York State government, a lot of liberals like myself celebrate the generosity of the safety net here and the strength of labor unions. But the bureaucracy, regardless of ideology, is absolutely gummed up and ineffectual. And the idea that we were going to trust an institution as lousy as the New York City Board of Elections to, quote unquote, educate voters adequately about this system coming out of a pandemic such as it is was always going to be laughable. And I think, especially if Adams, after winning first choice votes and being the preference of Black voters who already, sort of the question of the power of their vote is an emotionally loaded issue for them. If for some reason that outcome changes over the course of these ballot counting, I think it is liable to cause political disruptiveness here in the city. And frankly, I just don't know that when this was adopted as a policy, it does not seem as though this was adopted in a referendum, I believe, and it does not appear that people that there is as deep a well of support for this new system or as a deep an understanding of its merits as there should be, given how transformative it is, for better or worse.
Yeah, Daniel, that's interesting, and that addresses kind of first, one of the first questions that I had about this election is, would people coming out of the pandemic actually understand how to do ranked choice voting, and would a bunch of stuff be thrown out? And in addition, the kind of cumbersomeness of counting the votes into mid-July is not confidence inspiring. But I'd love to get your take on the other question that I had about the New York City mayoral elections, and that I think people across the country, especially Democrats, are looking at going into 2022. Is what was turnout like?
Yeah, I mean, it's looking like turnout is on track to be in these sort of 800,000 plus 900,000 range, which is pretty good by New York City standards, but not actually a whole lot of people in a city of 8.5 million people. Not actually a truly large percentage of the registered electorate. And, again, it could always be worse. There was a point in time where in order to vote in a contest like this, you would have needed to register as a Democrat 6 months before the election. But it is still a closed partisan primary. I spoke to some voters who were independents and were frustrated by being turned away at the polls. And again, I think that civic and political life in New York City is stagnant. And that is an indictment of the ruling Democratic Party establishment that for so long thrived on low turnout.
Yep, that's a very, very interesting take. Another interesting take to talking about what you said about the black vote, that, it's pretty interesting and I think really fantastic that there are two black candidates that are the number one and number two position in this race. Big change. I believe there's only been one other black man who is a mayor of New York City and never been a black woman. So pretty cool take and pretty cool to see that jump, actually. Daniel, always really good to have you with us. We appreciate your expertise, especially on this race. That was a lot of fun to watch with so many candidates. Appreciate you being here with us this morning.
Great to be here, guys.
Next on Rising, we discuss the striking Alabama miners and why they're taking their fight to Wall Street.